when it comes to the stuff that we could potentially have agency in, thoughtful, as you say, intentional optimism, which is not sort of toxic positivity, about sort of delusional ignoring the fact your house is burning down and there's a monster in your garden or whatever it is. But thoughtful, willed, intentional optimism is definitely an advantage. Plus, it's a more pleasant mental space to inhabit as well, day to day.
What do you do when nothing feels certain? Most conversations about the future sell clarity, predictions, roadmaps. But my guest today thinks that's exactly the wrong approach. Tamar Kasriel is a futurist and the author of Could, the smart thinking handbook for when nothing feels certain. She's spent decades advising some of the world's biggest organizations, not by predicting what's coming, but by helping them get ready for whatever does. We talk about why history teaches you to hold multiple truths at once, why pessimism has no predictive advantage, and why readiness isn't waiting, it's action. Now, this is part one of two conversations. If you're looking for certainty, this might unsettle you. But if you're looking for agency, stay with me. And Tamar. I'm Mark Fallows, and this is The Impossible Network. Tamar, welcome to The Impossible Network podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great to be chatting.
Yeah.
All the way from somewhere in England.
Yeah, at the moment, somewhere in England, in Cambridgeshire, near Cambridge, at the moment.
Okay, excellent. Let's get started, Tamar. We're going to have two interviews because you're about to launch a book. We'll do the deep dive into the book in the second interview that we'll probably do post the book launch. People can go and read your LinkedIn and realize the journey you've been on. And I think it's been fascinating. In a funny sort of way, there are parallels. You both worked in a complementary career path and me in working in advertising, where we used to tap into the big brains of people like you to tell us where the future was going to go so we could start to sell products to people they don't need for money they don't have. You ended up at the Henley Centre, but you studied history at Oxford and you went on to do Japanese. How on earth did you go from history and Japanese into that career path? Was that a conscious decision?
No, it wasn't. And what I sort of love about the way you frame this is you make it look like, and I can tell myself that it was all very tidy and planned and it all makes logical sense. But actually, that's not true at all. So in fact, I was thinking about this and I did French history and maths A-level, and I could have chosen any one of those things possibly to continue to study because I liked all of them and I couldn't choose. And the really positive interpretation of that might be that I'm some kind of polymath, but actually it's not. I was just really confused. And ultimately, I decided I wanted to study history, but I was also very interested in the historiography, which is kind of the study of history and understanding how that's done. And I'm not sure if you were planning to talk a bit about AI. I imagine it might come up somewhere. But thinking about it, I was thinking that actually, even though there's a real crisis in people studying humanities at the moment, sadly, in this country, some of the skills that you learn studying history are really, really very useful, because it's about thoughtful analysis, obviously, pattern spotting, trends. It's about understanding that the same story can be told in many different ways. And fundamentally, it's asking about, when you see a source, whatever it is, it's about asking who wrote this and why. What was their interest? What was their vested interest in all of this? Which is actually a really useful set of critical thinking skills to have in an age of disinformation. So yeah. I think that there's quite a lot in there that has been quite useful in terms of an outlook and a perspective. The bit I really love most, I think, ultimately was sort of 19th century European history. What's so fantastic about 19th century is obviously you've had the printing press for a while. There's this absolute explosion in first-person accounts of how people feel in fiction, in non-fiction, all sorts of things. I enjoyed that, and it was useful. The Japanese is because when it came to the end of my degree, I didn't know at all what I wanted to do. And they had then, I don't know if it still exists, but they had the sort of the milk round, which was when companies would come around to universities and kind of put on little events with some sort of food and drink and try and persuade you that you really wanted to join whatever consultancy, whatever. And I found those really not quite alienating. Didn't feel comfortable in there. I don't think they would have chosen me either. And then I discovered this thing called the JET program, which I think still exists, which is this amazing Japanese government program where you get sort of sponsored, paid well, and you're flown out to Japan, and it's a yearly contract that you can renew to go and teach English in Japanese state schools. So I went and did that for a couple of years and absolutely loved it. And I was staying somewhere which was an hour's plane ride away from Tokyo. And that meant that very, very few people spoke English. Unfortunately, including some of the English teachers couldn't speak English at all, but they could read and write it really beautifully. And that sort of sparked my interest in Japan and Japanese culture and Japanese. And as a result of that, I went on to do a master's in Japanese language and culture. So
Wow.
I wanted to go deeper into it, but I'm afraid I can't come up with a nice, tidy, logical thread between the history and the Japanese. And I hadn't, in fact, studied any Japanese history before I went. Although I think somewhere deep in my mind there was an interest fired up by an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum decades ago that I went to as a child, I think. And it was also beautiful and different and interesting that kind of germ of curiosity about Japan remained there.
That's quite fascinating. Well, I'm going to come on to that because the way you explained that non-linear path that you've taken reinforces something that Steve Jobs said at one of his commencement speech. But I'll come back to that later. I can't remember who said it, that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. I've never heard someone talk about the study of history.
It's the kind of the study of history. Yeah, it's the meta philosophy of, it's a philosophy of history.
I hadn't thought about this. So many things you hear today on some of these crazy podcasts that are almost rewriting history. You go, well, what is truth? If, one person's view of history is different to another person. So when you start to question the very nature of what you're taught or what you read, it makes you question the very reality of the life we're living today. How do you end up clarifying, saying, okay, this is the closest reality to what happened in the past? How do you determine that?
If we try and sort of unpack some of that, actually, although we prefer, as humans, we prefer tidiness and clarity, actually, I believe that our brains, most people's brains, can cope quite happily and function well with blurriness in certain spaces. And actually, with history, as you described it, the study of history, I think it's quite possible to appreciate that the same set of events can be seen quite differently and drawn quite differently. So there was that whole rash of books about 10 years ago which described what made the world, and I forget, Jared Diamond, he said it was guns, germs and steel, and then somebody else says it's about drinks, and somebody else says actually it's all decided by climate. And they're all right. None of them are wrong. And fairly early on, and I think it's still probably the case today, if you're looking, say, at GCSE history, you might look at the causes of the First World War. And you could say it was a shot fired by the assassin that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand or whatever. Yeah. And that was, but actually, quite early on, you start to see, well, there were all sorts of other things going on that meant that maybe a catastrophic world war was on the cards. And if it hadn't been that shot, it might have been something else. And being able to see that all of those different accounts have a kind of element of truth in them and it's just a different angle to look at the same thing, is a really useful human skill to have, I think. And what's problematic, and I'm slightly jumping and about to make a really massive sweeping statement, but as culture gets more and more short form, then there is less and less space for this kind of blurriness, which allows for a different version of the same thing to be held in space together. But they're all true.
In the 1980s, there was an ad from The Guardian called Points of View. So it was a skinhead running down the street looking really angry and threatening. You see a businessman in London with his bowler hat and his briefcase walking along. You think the skinhead's going to knock him out. And as he gets closer and closer, you then start to see that there are bricks falling from a building. And then the final scene, you see the skinhead
Yes,
hit
I
him.
do.
Yeah.
I
Well,
do. I thought
basically
that was Natalie Independent.
no, it was Guardian.
Sorry.
So the script was
Guardian,
an event
okay.
seen from one point of view gives one impression, seen from another, it gives quite a different impression. But it's only when you get the whole picture that you can fully understand what's going on. And I thought it's one of my favorite ads of all time. I mean, it's brilliant that. And in a way, what you just described about history, that frames almost the different perspectives and points of view that you can frame. And then you see the whole picture, you get a better sense of it. But anyway, I just want to throw that in there. But you ended up at the Guardian before you ended up at Henley. So Japan, you come back from there, you could have gone down a completely different path. Given that you're not, obviously, the way you've been describing things, everything's not being carefully planned out as a futurist. You aren't planning your future. How did you end up there in the Guardian and then become a futurist at Henley? I mean, that's a fascinating sort of little pivot.
Well, there's also lots of other jobs that don't make it to LinkedIn, not because they were
all right,
somehow
okay, then.
dubious
So there is something there.
or
There's a
anything.
path.
No, they just make the path even more blurry, or perhaps not. But when I was at school, I had lots of various different jobs, part-time jobs in different places. So when I was in the sixth form, so that's 16, 17, 18, it was absolutely the norm to go and work in the department store sales. They would take on temporary staff. So I did that at various different department stores, including Harvey Nichols, the very fancy store, where unfortunately I got fired very quickly, but whatever. But otherwise, I wasn't fired. I was very good, I think. I also did all sorts of things, catering, temping, working in canteens, and I also worked at Marplan, which was a market research agency. So that was my first brush with market research. And it was really interesting. And then also I took a gap year before I went to university, and I worked in Selfridges, the London department store.
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic place. I have some strong opinions that I'm happy to share on where it's gone. But at that point, it was still a fairly traditional department store, and I worked in the adult games and gift department. And I think retail is really fascinating, and I have remained really interested in retail because I think it's the sharp end of consumption.
That was your focus at Henley.
Well, retail and fast-moving consumer goods ended up being where I focused, but I did lots of different projects in lots of different sectors, but they all sort of started to converge around that. So I worked at Henley and after for almost, I think, all of the big global CPG, FMCG businesses, Coke and Nestle and Unilever and Reckitt.
Clearly, it's at the sharp end of what's actually happening in people's lives, and it reflects people's behaviors and attitudes, what they buy, how they react to the stories that were told to them by the advertisers and the brands. What was it that sparked your interest and curiosity so much?
I suppose because shops are where you can see a version of humanity that isn't displayed elsewhere. It's neither home and it's not work.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, I'm not especially interested in shopping for myself. It's not. I know some people really enjoy it and get a lot out of it, but I'm much more interested in seeing how other people shop and what they do, and how they interact, and what makes success or the opposite. And I think that shops are, a kind of microcosm of all sorts of interesting rules and trends, obviously about the product, but actually about human interaction and the way people are open to change, or their expectations of those micro moments of that tiny micro relationship that they have with the sales staff, and how that can be engineered, how it can create a moment of joy or otherwise. I also think pricing is very interesting, and it's also very accessible. So I think that the way people respond in those spaces, it's kind of all human life is there in a way. And what's really interesting is how much the death of the physical store was over prophesied, and ultimately now what we keep seeing all the time is purely virtual players wanting some kind of physical space to be able to offer an experience and all the rest of it.
You worked at that period of sort of dramatic change. I mean, we're going through huge exponential change at the moment, but your time at Henley straddled the point of pre-internet and to the emergence of the internet and e-commerce. So you must have seen some interesting sort of trends in terms of changing behaviors during that period. But I suppose people's innate sort of core behaviors and motivations don't change, regardless of whether it's online purchases, direct to consumer. We all still have the same motivations and same desires and why we buy brands, not rationally, but emotionally. Is that fair?
Partly yes, and partly no. I think it's always more useful to focus on people rather than technology, because technology is almost limitless. And then to think about, well, what consumer need is this technology perhaps answering, and trying and guessing how we're going to appropriate it or fit it in or reject it. But actually, it does change people, and at some really fundamental levels, but the cycles, the timelines are different. So it would be madness to suggest that mobile phones haven't changed the way we interact and our expectations of time and immediacy and what human relationships mean. But it depends on how high you slice the cake in terms of how granular you look at basic human needs. So that sort of really basic physiological level, which is those basic human impulses around desire for connection or disgust or all of those things. So those things do seem to run on relatively slow kind of evolutionary cycles, but expressed very differently. But if you're thinking about, say, people's expectations of what a somehow meaningful or fulfilling human relationship means, that changes at a very different cycle. So it just depends on how far back you stand.
So you worked at Henley at that amazing transformational time in Britain, cool Britannia, the millennium, the emergence of social media, and then ultimately the launch of the iPhone. That very transformative 10-year period that you worked through. What corners were you seeing around then when you're living with this change?
At the time, I'm not sure that cool Britannia felt like a genuine summary of the zeitgeist. It did feel at the time, as I recall, a slightly hopeful label attached with some political shrewdness, a bit of a sticking plaster, or I don't know why this phrase comes in, but lipstick on a pig, just to stuff that actually wasn't all that necessarily all that rosy. I mean, for sure there was a sort of fantastic phase of creativity in music and arts that a lot of those things have kind of endured and influenced today's music and so on. So it wasn't nothing.
But it was, but to my point, it was influencing what was happening in retail. Because I just remember working in advertising, we were looking at how could you in any way possible connect that cultural, as you say, a bit of a mini zeitgeist to a brand. It would try and appropriate it, borrowed interest, and go, I want to connect to that, whether it be through the art of Damien Hirst or be through Blur or Oasis or the Spice Girls. Everyone wanted a piece of the action. You must have been aware of that at the time as a futurist, advising clients in retail and in FMCG.
It's quite hard to explain succinctly, but I talk a bit about this in the book as well, is that when we're talking about how to understand what's happened, and we often want to be able to pin it on a nice, tidy thing. So it's interesting, you've mentioned Steve Jobs, and for sure, he was a genius and a fantastic man, but there were many things that combined to make Apple the incredible sort of juggernaut that it is today. And it wasn't just him. It was movements around technology. It was the people around him, all sorts of different stuff. And in a slightly different way, if you mentioned retail, for example, and I would say that we talked about Selfridges. So Selfridges became to some extent a very cool British place. And at that time, all the department stores that I would go to or speak to around the world, actually, Selfridges was the reference point. So if you went to Pranton, if you went somewhere or you talked to the management, wherever it was like, well, we have to see what's going on in Selfridges because there's something special there. And I would suggest that a lot of that was due to, there was a really visionary guy called Vittorio Radice who was put in charge of Selfridges. And he had a real grand vision for what the department store could be and for reimagining what is the meaning of this space. And he put on these sort of big events. So there was one on Japan I remember getting invited to. It was just fantastic. It was immersive. It was experiential. It was really forward looking. And I think that, well, yes, there was this nice broad brush, cool Britannia thing going on. And maybe had Radice not been able, not come at that time, he might have been able to assemble these things and to slightly ride on the coattails, perhaps, of cool Britannia to get some borrowed glow from all of this. I think that a lot of it was around, that incredible flourishing of British retail. And I think some of it still sort of lingers-ish, though not quite as gloriously, was around particular people, particular visions and creativity and opportunism, actually. But it did filter through to retail. But I think there was a general reimagining, and at that point, a very creative and positive one about what retail could mean in terms of public spaces. Because while the sort of civil space, their meaning and their purpose, and all these questions around what technology and digital technology does to people's interactions was going on, there's something very leveling about retail. And what was really interesting, about Selfridges, and this is why I think if anyone's interested, I think they've gone wrong, actually, in quite short-termist, is Selfridges used to be, it was a place you would dress up to go to. It was a special place, but it was for everyone. And there was a really strong understanding that yellow Selfridges bag was highly aspirational. And it was really well understood that if somebody bought something in that little yellow bag and that was their trophy, then that was fine, even if they weren't buying a £1,000 jeans or whatever it was. Really, impressive long-term perspective about where it could fit in British culture.
And it's not that now?
In global culture, actually. I don't think it is. I think that, so it's had a sort of a very extensive refit, and it's tilted very much towards kind of high lux. They've got a very understandable focus on wealthy customers from China, from the Middle East, but it has, in my opinion, while that it has lost focus to some extent, and that's not a long-term strategy because it's now somewhat intimidating when you go into the handbags entrance. I don't know if that's the one you ever go to, and it has no sense of place. They still have the beauty playground, and that is buzzy and exciting, and I think has a lot of sort of interesting spirit, but the kind of high lux elements are just sort of empty cavernous halls, and you could be in Dubai or you could be in Shanghai. It's not possible to tell where you are, and perhaps paradoxically that's actually that race to the top is actually a race to the bottom, because you'll have to just keep competing and you're very much at the mercy of the kind of vicissitudes of the luxury market.
So going back to that period in your time at Henley and looking back on that and seeing how we live today and how things have transformed, as a futurist, you give your clients guidance in terms of what to prepare for, the signals and the trends. Do you think, can you look back and go, oh yeah, I was right there, or I was wrong there, and I was wrong for that reason? Do you do that?
So I can think of one example, which was, well, two actually, which I remember articulating as things that I felt were quite important. One of them went into a very long and involved project for Coca-Cola in Atlanta, which was around saying that companies would end up becoming increasingly political and would have to take a stance on all sorts of political things, which turned out to be absolutely right, which feels really prescient.
I suppose the interesting thing of where you are now and what you've been doing since you left Henley to do your own company, Future Real, you've got much richer data sources to pull on than you maybe had back then. The world has changed and so I suppose I'm jumping forward a wee bit, but has it become easier to do what you do today, given the access to data, or has it become more overwhelming and difficult because there's so much data?
Well, there is so much data, and actually, I initially thought, because I used to cast myself as a trend spotter, and then initially I thought, my goodness, there's so many people who are now spotting trends and doing all the rest of it that I thought maybe I'd be out of a job. But actually, what's happened with this kind of overwhelming wave of data is, yes, it's very accessible, but your job is to find some meaning and pattern, as you say, pattern spotting, meaning in all of this noise, but also the creating that future picture, that plausible scenario. That is not the end of the story, actually. I mean, it's all very nice, but it's not useful. So I came up with and have sort of stuck to this phrase of, it's not about being right, it's about being ready. So fine, if you say is what's going to happen, but unless you say, well, what on earth do you do with it? Then it's just a sort of a nice to have. And it's much better to be able to consider different options and create some kind of strategy so that you're ready for whichever one turns out.
How does that affect their operational strategies? Does it have to mean that they have to become more agile, ready for rapid change? Is the secret in the implementation? And are the companies that do prepare and do react to the types of trends that you identify and the signals you give them, is there a difference in terms of the way that they're structured or how they operate between the ones that do it well and the ones that don't do it well?
Yes, I do. And yes, there is a difference. But if we take a step back for a second, the process itself is really important. What I've come to realize, having done this quite a lot for many different companies, and I've done a lot of scenario planning and different futures projects, is that the more that you, as the consultant, the official outsider, whatever you're, however you cast yourself, can know about the company or the organization, And the more that the organization itself can be involved in considering their own future, the better it's going to be, because it's quite possible to sort of create a set of scenarios and just give them to people. And then I would say largely they just gather dust and they say, well, okay. But there's actually the process itself is very, very important. And quite often, if I mention that I'm a futurist, when I meet people and they say, oh, what's going to happen? Or what's in the future then? And I don't have a ready answer, A, because it's such a massive question and I'm always slightly flawed by that, but also because the answer to that question will be different for Nestle than it is for Unilever, and it will be different within Unilever for, home care versus personal care, blah, blah, blah. Because the future for even one business unit will be very different because their present is very different. And the limits of possibility for them is different, and the vision of the leader and the permission of the board and all of these things will mean that what might be a very sensible and plausible outcome for one department is highly implausible for another. So I think that what's great about having one's own company, organization, whatever, is that at times I've had the privilege of being allowed right into an organization, and the more it's sort of tailored to them, then ultimately the more bespoke what comes out at the other end is to them and their future, and the more it can kind of make sense and find traction and hopefully become something useful. So, but the other thing I would also say is that in some ways, all of these different techniques. I mean, I like scenario planning. I think it's got an interesting history, and it's a really useful tool, and it's been done a lot. And there are many processes to fit different needs and different situations. But the good thing about the future as well is, especially if you're looking not next year or the next 2 years, but say 5 years or 10 years hence, it's really liberating, because normally when people do strategy sessions or annual rethinks and budgets and all the rest of it, inevitably they're thinking about their own personal stuff and what office they're going to get, and their budgets and their promotions, and all sorts of things that any human would think about when they're in one of these organizations. But when it comes to 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, there's a kind of understanding that it's not about them, actually. They may well not be there. It's about the future of whatever that organization is.
You use that word being ready. That's being in a preparedness, a sort of almost like a static state. I wonder if, you say a lot of times these reports will end up just gathering dust. Therefore, people don't implement the insights that have been generated by the work people like you do. I wonder if there's companies that do implement well, there's an intentionality that they go, okay, here are 3 potential futures. We're going to go after this one. And they start to implement it, and it becomes from strategic foresight to strategic planning and strategic implementation.
It's quite interesting that you see readiness as passive, because I don't see readiness as passive.
I mean, because it's a new.
I think I see sort of readiness as quite lean forward, actually, and I think that when you consider,
I agree.
Yeah, sorry, please.
I agree, but being a runner, get ready, get set. You haven't gone yet. You're ready. You're prepared. You've done the training. You've done the groundwork. You've got the right mental attitude, but you're waiting for something to click in, something to happen, a trigger. You're in a ready state. I'm not saying it's completely passive, but it would imply that there have to have been certain actions taken ahead of being ready. So there has to be something between where you leave people with your recommendations and your strategies, between there and becoming ready. You can't just suddenly hear your presentations and the end of your Coca-Cola, at the end of your 1 year report, and going, right, okay, we're ready for it because we know about it. You have to then adjust the organization to then be in that state of readiness. The same way that a country would be in a state of readiness for changes in geopolitical order or whatever, or impact
Okay,
of
so
AI or climate.
that's really interesting, and it's really useful that I now understand what your idea of readiness is. It's somebody at the start line waiting for the ready, set, go, right? So the readiness that I'm talking about is completely different. It's it's the training, it's the right shoes, it's whatever you need if the weather goes funny. It's some kind of readiness in case, I don't know, something falls off, something gets in your way. It's it's a preparedness, and it's also not goal oriented. I never know how to say that word, in the way that a race is that you get to the finish line, actually, because when you mentioned it earlier, you sort of framed it as, so there's these possible futures and we're going to pick that one and go for it. And
So
actually,
you're talking more in
quite
terms of an
often
agility.
it is an agility, but it's also what sometimes happens, and is actually, I talk about this quite a lot in the book, is that the most useful thing that comes out of, say, a scenario planning exercise is not that you say, well, if that happens, we're going to go for it and we're going to do our absolute best to aim for that. It's actually finding the strategy that makes sense across different scenarios, even if it doesn't necessarily mean that it's absolute optimal for one, but it means that there's some kind of risk management and then optimization across more than one. It's like a risk spreading exercise as well. You're not betting everything on 24 red. You're
Yeah,
actually
I see.
saying, depending
Yeah.
on what, on, you know, we have these sensible things, but also it's not meant to be a static, finite process. It's not meant to be, well, we've done it now, so even if you thought it through a bit more and you say, well, we know that this scenario is emerging because we've worked out that this signal, this particular metric will go up or down or whatever it is, and once it hits that, we know that that scenario is emerging. You actually have to keep updating it because stuff changes all the time. And I got what I think is quite a good example. So during COVID, something that I think was really amazing and wonderful was how well, at least in Britain, the supermarkets coped with this absolutely unimaginable scenario. And to some extent, yes, we did run out of toilet paper a bit, but the food supply was maintained, and I think in a way that sort of it's there's to some extent, of course, you know, that there's a lot of bad stuff that happens or whatever that has happened, but in a way they're one of the kind of unsung heroes of the stuff that kept us all going, that maybe we didn't have exactly what we wanted, but there was food supply. And in fact, I was somewhat involved in some scenario planning that one of the really big supermarkets did for SARS. I don't know if you remember, but there was a point when we really thought that be, you know, that might be something that was sort of topple the global economy. And because they had done a load of thoughtful scenario planning about what they would do if SARS emerged, they had kind of rehearsed their responses. And so when COVID came along, it was not this sudden, I mean, it was a sudden bolt from the blue, but they were able to go through those kind of steps. And had they not had that kind of preparation and that kind of readiness, I think things could have been even worse than they were.
Do you think what you're describing can apply to individuals in the same way?
Well, I do. Funny you should ask. No, the first book I published was called Futurescaping, and I published it with Bloomsbury over 10 years ago, 2012. And that was about scenario planning and how people I thought, could use it usefully in their personal lives. And I still think they can, actually. Yeah, because, I mean, in a way, this book now that's coming out soon is a logical progression of that in a way, because that was talking about managing uncertainty, albeit not so explicitly.
How do you measure success?
I think that there's different things. So there might be what I might personally define as success on a project, but ultimately what's most important is that whatever element that I was involved in turns out to be useful and used. And to me, that is sort of the ultimate thing that I can hope to do. Sometimes you're called in as a futurist because there's a genuine desire and interest to understand what might happen and how the company could move. And sometimes it might be more about a sort of back covering exercise, risk management, being able to say, well, we thought this through. It's a kind of anticipation of regret, perhaps, and making sure that blame does not get apportioned. But if people find it useful, then yes, that is the ultimate. I think there's also a thing which is really delightful, that most people work pretty hard and they're incredibly knowledgeable about their domain. They have the domain expertise, and actually, I think a lot of the time could do my job, but all of us, you sort of, sorry, going back to that outsider thing, but you do need somebody to come kind from the outside and maybe help you see the stuff that you haven't given yourself permission to look at and to notice. And so I suppose for me personally, when somebody, as well as it being useful, that is the main thing. But also if somebody says, I enjoyed this process and I found it really interesting. And sometimes you can see that it, after that perhaps first discomfort of having to look at what they're doing and think about what the organization is doing. And quite often what emerges is a lot of disagreement about what people think the company is for or the organization is for. But that once you've sort of got through that thicket, then really seeing people kind of bloom and reconnect with what on earth they're going into work to do every day, and that whether it's a mission-driven business or it's really just about the bottom line, if that's what gets them going, and I think that's quite rewarding. But if you can improve their sort of working life and working outlook and enable people to reconnect with what it is they love about their organization and their job and what they're doing, and that's brilliant.
So let's go from that last book where you said it could apply to people, futurescaping, to your new book, which is called Could, and we'll come on to do an interview about that once it's launched, but it's called Could, the Smart Thinking Handbook for When Nothing is Certain. It's an unusual title, first of all, because as a futurist, it's about creating greater sense of certainty. You've actually got a title that's saying when nothing's certain. But it's actually a title that feels like a manifesto for the moment we're living in right now, because we are probably living in the most uncertain of times, where we don't know where the world's going because of the rapid pace of change, almost the exponential pace of change that AI is bringing. So I suppose my first question is, what's different about this book versus Futurescaping?
Oh, okay. So Futurescaping was much more was really about scenario planning. The history of scenario planning is really fascinating. So it was kind of pioneered at the Rand Corporation by this incredible guy called Herman Kahn and his group of what became known as the Megadeth intellectuals, who had this idea for, at that point the world was terrified of nuclear Armageddon. So Herman Kahn's idea was that if we are paralyzed by this to some extent, and if we could imagine what the world would be like beyond this awfulness, then that actually can enable us to think through possible different future scenarios, essentially. So that's scenario planning. And I think just the idea of scenario planning, the idea of multiple futures, is itself very interesting. And that was really the focus of the book. And also I had a fabulous research assistant, and we tried out the methodology on lots of different people, and I interviewed Daniel Kahneman that was fantastic because he'd just done Thinking Fast and Slow. And it was really much more of a focus on that particular technique. Whereas now, this is sort of more broadly about managing uncertainty. I do mention scenario planning in there, but it's not the main focus of the book. But I would push back slightly on your, well, that you said that being a futurist is about making people more certain. I would say, well, I'm not.
Okay.
I think, if anything, it's about making them accept, be a bit more comfortable with uncertainty, actually, number one. Sorry. And number two,
I'm
I
ready.
would...
Ready for the uncertainty.
You're ready, Professor. Great. Not uncomfortable at all. But also, while I agree that there are some particular things that mean, yes, the speed of change has accelerated, I think it is incorrect to just assume that because we know how history went, because we know how the end of the story got to it, that the people living through the Industrial Revolution, the First World War, the mainstreaming of cars, the printing press, I mean, these were hugely terrifying and discombobulating and upsetting events, and people lost their jobs and they didn't know what was going on, and the world was turned upside down for them. So I think that understanding that humans have adapted through periods of huge upheaval and uncertainty, I find personally quite comforting. So in a way, the future's always looked a bit like this. So yeah.
You picked the word could rather than should or will. Why did you pick that word could?
Well, so I don't think that should. I quite like the idea of a book called Should. It's just bossing people about and telling them what they should do. But I'm definitely not going to be the person to write that book, because I wanted it to contain the idea of uncertainty, but also to contain the suggestion of a positive outcome. So I toyed with all sorts of different things, like maybe and perhaps, but they sounded too diffident. Whereas could, I felt, includes the possibility of energy and positivity and action. You could. And I think that that's quite important, because I think that certainly when I've been looking around and working on various futures projects and so on, I think people are finding it increasingly difficult to even imagine the possibility of a positive outcome. So the book is about uncertainty, but it's also a lot about willed optimism as well.
I'm sure everyone is aware of the fact that everyone's talking about the AI bubble. And there's a guy in New York who's got, I think it's either an investment fund, I think he's part of a financial management company. I think it's Riddle's Wealth Management. But his name's Josh Brown. He's quite a character. He's a sort of a typical New Yorker. And he's got a podcast called The Compound and Friends. And he talks a lot about, in terms of his way of looking at the markets, is it's like what could go right rather than what could go wrong. And so many people in the market and that are thinking and looking at things that are happening in the world they're always going, oh, what could go wrong, and be prepared for that. But it's a very different mental model when you think about what could go right. And it's a binary choice. And I know what you're talking about. You've used that word could. And I think a lot of people naturally, and I think it's a cultural thing as well, if you're Scottish or British, you tend to be can be a little bit more pessimistic than maybe in America. There's much more of a positive, opportunist, mentality.
Right.
Maybe it's changed recently, but that idea of like what could go right and being prepared for it, and smart, as you say, smart thinking handbook, when nothing's certain, but it gives you a certain amount of agency to think, I have the ability to affect the direction the world goes in, rather than just being reactive and being ready for when it goes wrong. It's a completely different mindset. Being, as you say, using that word ready, being organizationally ready for when it goes tits up, to saying good, being prepared and intentional and taking action to direct the events that unfold. I think there's a difference, and I think it
There
works
is.
from a individual standpoint, and it works from a leadership standpoint, and it's almost like a leadership theory. How do you want to lead people, whether it's for your family, whether it be your team, whether it be your organization, or whether it be your country? It's it's a
There
big.
absolutely is. Yeah.
Mhm.
But there are things that you can control as a family, as a person, as an organization, and there are things you can't. And obviously, in order to understand where you might have agency, you need to have some sense of what is beyond your control. Otherwise, we're all kind of king canutes telling the waves to go forward and back or whatever it is. But when it comes to the stuff we can't control, pessimism has no predictive advantage. And when it comes to the stuff that we could potentially have agency in, thoughtful, as you say, intentional optimism, which is not sort of toxic positivity, about sort of delusional ignoring the fact your house is burning down and there's a monster in your garden or whatever it is. But thoughtful, willed, intentional optimism is definitely an advantage. Plus, it's a more pleasant mental space to inhabit as well, day to day.
Contagious.
Hopefully.
Well, the book's going to come out when?
I think it's probably going to come out next month, December
Excellent. Okay.
2025.
Well,
Yeah.
we won't give any more away about what the actual handbook, what the handbook says, because I'm certainly
Okay.
keen to find out, and I'll read it, and
Okay.
we'll do a follow-up on that. But I want to
Yeah.
I'm going to go back. We've already talked about Steve Jobs before, but I'm going to bring it up again, that he had this line, which is, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only look looking back. And it feels it's almost like this, it's the opposite of what you do, because you're trying to connect dots and tell people how to be ready and how to prepare and all that. And his whole thing was, you can't. I think people misunderstand the statement. I mean, he hated deterministic thinking. I suppose if you tried to optimize for clarity today, the idea was you kill the possibilities that only emerge over time. And he was a great believer in the fact that there's an opportunity cost when you reject sort of strange things, or you go on a very planned and specific path. You discount opportunities as they emerge from out of nowhere. And I suppose the word I'd use is serendipity. So the deeper point is that trust and curiosity are strategies, not vibes, that you can combine and bring out these opportunities that emerge and embrace them with trust and curiosity, and it can lead somewhere you never expected. Now, I don't know if that works for organizations, but I think it's very powerful for individuals. And if you become too deterministic, if you become too rigid in terms of going, this is the path I'm going to take, you miss opportunities that emerge out of nowhere. And I don't know if I'm just rambling, but there's something in there. I need to do more thinking around it. Maybe I need to read your book first.
Yeah, I think there is, there's definitely something in there, but I think there's a load of sort of different threads that are a bit mixed up. So let's say manifesto is not prophecy, and I think that an opportunity, and opportunism, and so serendipity is neither of those two things. So
Well, that's
I
fair.
think that kind of deterministic view of the future, which is about a unwavering path to where I want to get to, is kind of the antithesis of the openness to uncertainty and different possibilities kind of futurism that I'm talking about. And I think that there's a lot of confusion around this, because there's no doubt that uncertainty or U-turns or whatever it happens to be are not considered attractive or useful attributes in a leader. It's seen as dithering, is that the person at the front has to make it very clear that they're driving the bus and they know where the road is going. And it's interesting how persuasive that can be. And because they were written there, they sort of felt like they were true. So there is a pressure on leaders to look like they perhaps have more certainty than they do. And regardless of what people might say about being authentic and human and admitting fault and all the rest of it, I think some of that still stands. But away from those sort of extreme situations, I think that this very predetermined sense of where things are going to go is not useful. And I was kind of wondering about why people seem to be reluctant to embrace the idea of agency generally, because I completely agree with you that a lot of that sense has kind of been lost, that we're just these passive recipients of awful stuff that keeps happening. And I think part of it is because it's quite scary that agency comes with accountability, that you did something, and there's a sort of fear that goes with that you're going to get blamed. But actually, and again, I talk about this in the book as well, is that not doing anything, no decision is also a decision, is also a strategy, actually. So we can't hide from it. But how much better it is to feel that I certainly found it much more comforting to think that the place I've got to, that I've had something to do with it, even if it's not a great place. I just love that thing that, you know, if you miss the bus, miss it running, try. And then if you might miss the bus, but give it a go.
So going back to your word ready, making a
Okay.
decision versus not making a decision. If you're ready, you're just doing nothing. You're ready to react to whatever happens around you. If you're ready to act, you're taking intentionality, you're acting. So I think that's the difference. That
Right.
you're saying with intentionality, with agency, you make decisions, you act on it. That's your readiness. The readiness that is passive is waiting for situations and circumstances to impact you, and then you react to them. Therefore,
Right.
that's not agency, if
Fair
that's
enough.
fair.
Yeah, different kinds of readiness.
I think I'm going to leave it there. I think that is a good place
Okay.
to end this version, this part one of the interview. We'll come back after the book's launched and we'll dive into it. I'll have a chance to read it, and we'll talk about how could is going to impact people's lives and hopefully leaders and potentially even countries, mindsets and sense of agency going forward. So for now, thank you very much, and we'll follow up soon.
Okay, thank you very much.
Excellent.
Okay, that's all for now, folks. Now here's my ask of you. Please follow this podcast on Apple or Spotify or whatever player you use. Also, please subscribe to our new Random Collisions newsletter. We really are working to build a global community of action takers, action engines of people that really care about the problems that need solving. Thank you very much, and see you next time.